Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the editor of the Dissenter newsletter over at thedissenter.org. And welcome to this week's edition of the show, The Dissenter Weekly, the podcast for the Dissenter newsletter. We've got a show to mark Donald Trump's 100 days in his second presidential term. But before I get to the conversation that was recorded for this week, please take a moment to go to thedissenter.org and become a subscriber if you're not a subscriber already. Take a moment to support this show by subscribing to the podcast. Go to the various podcasting platforms and find it if you're not following it already. You can give it a rating. That's one way to support this work without having to donate or give money. But also, if you are willing and are interested in supporting this independent journalism on whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy, please support this work. Supporting means more voices can be brought into this. That means I can give other journalists and writers a platform, and it means I can continue to produce this show and also to publish the articles that appear at the Dissenter newsletter. And this type of media is incredibly important. 100 days into Trump, whether it's the independent journalism of the Dissenter or other news publications, small, working on shoestring budgets, other movement media, all of these media outlets are crucial to challenging the trajectory in which we find ourselves under President Donald Trump. And so that's the conversation. If you've been following the Dissenter Weekly's shows, this is the 13th episode. Every week since Donald Trump was inaugurated, I've had a rundown of stories from the past week that dug into the most incredible developments, the most noteworthy developments with Trump's administration. But now I have two experts who will join me, who I'm very fond of welcoming to this show. Seth Stern, the advocacy director for Freedom of the Press Foundation, and someone we already interviewed earlier in this podcast, but we have Lauren Harper, the Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation, joining along with Seth to break all of this down. The attacks on the press, the attacks on transparency that have been systematic during Donald Trump's administration. So stay tuned for that. And then I'll be back with a brief message at the end of this episode. There's a marker for assessing political administrations, and I think this is very useful for getting into the wide discussion of where we stand when it comes to freedom of the press as well as open government. So, let's embrace this moment that we have people's attention and they are interested in where things stand. So, being that I talked with you several weeks ago, I'll start with Seth first and just have you set up. Where do you think things are at the moment as far as freedom of the press, and how do you assess Trump's first 100 days and what is remarkable?
Yeah, I don't think anyone expected this administration to be friendly towards the free press, given what happened in Trump's first term, given the rhetoric that we have heard from Trump and plenty of people close to him. But I think that the attacks have come faster than expected. We're going to be listing 100 press freedom violations from Trump's first 100 days. And it was alarming how easy that was to do. 100 sounds like a big number, but it really just took an hour of brainstorming in a spreadsheet to come up with 100 examples of ways Trump has attacked the free press in his first 100 days. We even had to scrap a few. But it's not just the number of attacks, because, of course, they're not all equal. Calling a reporter a name is not the same thing as dismantling an entire news outlet. So what's remarkable, in addition to the number of attacks, is just how many journalists and how many consumers of news that they impact. And what is also remarkable is that these attacks on the free press aren't happening in a bubble. They're part of a broader assault on the rule of law. At the same time, the free press is being attacked, academia is being attacked, museums, essentially any institution that allows facts to emerge, however imperfect those institutions may be, they stop Trump's alternative facts from becoming the only facts. And that's what he is looking to get rid of. And he's trying to do so fairly quickly. So the decline of the free press in the United States certainly didn't start with Donald Trump. We've talked plenty between us, and I think we've both published plenty about everything the Biden administration did, everything the Obama administration did, so on and so forth. In some ways, Trump is accelerating what came before him, but in other ways, he's doing things that are entirely new. The use of the public interest standard in the FCC's rules to argue that a presidential administration can decide what speech by broadcast licensees is and isn't in the public's interest based on whether it's favorable to his policies or not. That's not something that Biden tried. That's not something that, as far as I know, anyone has tried, because in the past everyone has recognized that those kinds of phrases, vague and ambiguous as they may be, are just obviously second to the First Amendment. It's just sort of fundamentally un-American to think that any regulation could possibly allow the government to decide what speech is in the public interest. And like so many other things we're seeing attacked by this administration, there was this just reliance on norms and assumptions that nobody would ever have the nerve to try certain arguments. And as a result, nobody ever bothered, codifying any real protections to stop those arguments or to close those loopholes, tighten up that ambiguous language. So some of it is more the same, just faster and more powerful. Some of it is entirely new. I can't say we don't have press freedom or free speech anymore. I'm sitting here saying what I want to say to you, and I'm not particularly worried that anyone's going to come barge through my door and take me away. Although it's more of a concern than it was a few months ago, I'll say that. But it's, at this point, that is not a highly likely event. So does that mean we still have a free press to some extent? I guess, but it's slipping away.
There are definitely glaring issues, and we'll drill down on some of the specifics which you were getting into. As I sit here, I think that it's good that we're not talking about a new Espionage Act prosecution in the first 100 days, but maybe that's just a feature of the system grinding slowly, because we've heard names floated of people who could be targeted and charged in manner that we've seen regularly under both the first Trump administration and Barack Obama's administration. So let me move to Lauren here and allow you to get in. And I also saw that you've launched the Freedom of the Press launched the classified catalog, allowing everyone to more closely follow what is happening with secrecy news over the past 100 days. So bring us into what you've seen over the last 100 days and the trends that stand out to you as far as, basically going against any principles of open government?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the issues that the open government community and those who advocate for, access to government information and freedom of information face a lot of the similar problems that, are the free press is encountering right now. And I think if we're looking at like the big problems in the government secrecy space, for example, things like overclassification, like the Freedom of Information Act not being even coming close to being properly implemented, as you've written about, with growing problems with things like FOIA offices not having the tech or the staff that they need to preserve records. These issues are perennial. They've been issues for decades, regardless who is in office, if it's a Democrat or a Republican. These are systemic problems. But I think the thing that is unique to Trump and to this term in particular, that differentiates this Trump term from his first term is the multi-pronged attack on various transparency functions, regardless of how well they operate in normal times. So, for example, things like firing entire FOIA offices and firing most of the inspectors general across the country, replacing independent and professional leadership at the National Archives with Marco Rubio, who's becoming the busiest man in Washington. And, things like rapidly shuttering entire bureaus, talking about rapidly shuttering entire departments without any apparent effort to lawfully preserve the records at those bureaus and departments. These are all unique to this term. I also think we're seeing more flagrant intimidation and censoring of current employees. For example, we're seeing inspector general offices at the U.S. Agency for International Development, for example, not releasing two reports in particular because they were worried about even more retaliation from the Trump administration. This is not normal in this country. And I also think we're seeing a heightened awareness within the Trump administration of the ways that it can exploit things like record keeping laws. I think, in some ways, the first Trump administration or Trump learned a lot from the fact that he was able to flagrantly violate the Presidential Records Act at the beginning of his first term and faced no repercussions for it. I also think we're seeing entities within the administration move much faster than I think the courts could have the ability to stop them. I think DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is a good example. And the fact that the administration even had the awareness to make DOGE a Presidential Records Act entity so it wouldn't be subject to FOIA for the foreseeable future shows that they are thinking about ways to obfuscate records laws. So one of the existential questions that I think we're waiting to find the answer to this term is if courts are capable of ruling on things like DOJ's record-keeping status. That's one. Before DOJ has the opportunity to completely shutter something like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for example, and done gosh knows what with their records. So I think we're seeing continuation of trends, but certainly we're seeing things very different this term that are happening much more quickly.
Yeah, and it seems rather clear, Lauren, that this administration will engage in retaliation against judges for ruling in a manner that nobody would have questioned 5, 10, or 15 years ago if they were part of the executive branch. I mean, they would have been upset about it, but they wouldn't have tried to take action. And now we're seeing things of like, you could be accused of obstructing justice. You could be accused of obstructing quote unquote government effectiveness. I was reading one of the things about going after leakers. It added a category that I don't even know how you define this vague term. I've never seen it before, but it wasn't just foreign policy and national security, which already are vague terms, but suggesting that people standing in the way of government effectiveness could face attack. It's something to consider. So let me come back to you, Seth, and ask what you think are the more egregious examples. You were going through some of the examples. Or what signifies, I think, the most how Trump is going to deal with the press in your mind?
Aside from the FCC's attacks, which I previously mentioned, which are continuing and accelerating with recent threats to retaliate against reporting on abductions and deportations to El Salvador, truthful reporting, reporting that is consistent with, at this point, Supreme Court jurisprudence, even that the administration deemed contrary to the public interest, in addition to everything else the FCC has pulled. And I should mention, while we're on the FCC, in addition to the actions that agency is taking, what's telling is how Trump is staffing that agency. Brendan Carr, the chair of the FCC, I don't think there's any controversy in calling him a political hack. The man wears a golden bust of Trump as a lapel pin. That I think by definition makes you a political hack. If not, I don't know what. But so the idea of staffing these agencies with low principled people, I can't say that Brendan Carr is incompetent, because he actually does have experience in communications law, and he knows exactly why everything he's doing is wrong. He's not incompetent. He is just using his competence for bad reasons. But putting Ed Martin in charge of the prosecutor's office in D.C. is another example. Somebody who is threatening Wikipedia over their alleged bias, seemingly with no understanding that the role of a federal prosecutor is not to investigate bias by news outlets or online encyclopedias. It's to investigate crimes. In his case, he might actually not know that. He has no prosecutorial experience. He is not, like Brendan Carr, somebody who's got the resume for the position, but is abusing his power. He's someone who just shouldn't be there and is also abusing his power. But when putting those aside, you've got to look at, I would say, the dismantling of the White House press corps, and that's not something that when it first started I was super focused on. It started with, okay, we're going to bar the AP from some bill signing where Trump takes out his Sharpie and signs, or some executive order signing. And I'm thinking, well, why are you there anyway? Like, well, you don't need a photographer taking pictures of him signing another stupid document. Go do some real reporting. But it's escalated so much since then, and it has become not so much a matter of whether you are a big fan of the White House Correspondents Association or of, access journalism and all that kind of stuff, but it's just setting a precedent for the executive to be able to decide who does and does not get access, based on whether he's satisfied with your coverage and confident that you'll bend the knee when asked. And the public really suffers, because even if putting aside the White House coverage, the Associated Press, Reuters, now Bloomberg, all three major wire services have been eliminated from the press pool. They've got contracts with local newspapers around the country that don't have the resources to send their own journalists to Washington, D.C. For their coverage of the White House and the Hill. And if they can't provide that coverage, they're going to lose those contracts. They're no longer going to be able to provide the service that their customers signed up for. And what's going to happen? The small town paper, in wherever in small town Oklahoma, isn't going to suddenly spring for a DC reporter. They're just going to drop that coverage, and then all that we're going to have left is cable news. So these attacks might stem from Trump's ego or desire for control, but the impact is on everyone across the country, including a lot of areas that heavily support Trump. Rural America that relies on AP dispatches for national news in the local papers, or that relies on NPR and PBS. Another major theme of the first 100 days, public funded media. And for years there's been a debate with people on the right who think that public media is biased, or that these days, with all the other options out there, it is no longer necessary for taxpayers to subsidize public media. I disagree, but that's a legitimate debate. That's not a debate we're having right now. This is not a policy thing. This is an effort by the administration to silence the entire media and to go for public funded media first, because the public funding makes it the low hanging fruit. There's a string attached that he can cut. More difficult to do that with private or nonprofit news outlets, although he's certainly working on ways of doing that as well. And of course, I can't neglect to mention SLAPP suits. It's remarkable that we have a sitting president with multiple absolutely frivolous SLAPP suits pending against media outlets and related entities, from the Des Moines Register and their pollster, to CBS News, to the board of the Pulitzer Prizes. He's managed to get immunity from the Supreme Court, but that is, a shield, and they gave him that shield, but they didn't make him turn in his sword. So he's continuing to attack while he can't be attacked. And as we've seen, it has nothing to do with the merits of these cases. It has to do with the leverage the cases give him over his critics. Whether it be news outlets that self-censor out of fear of further retaliation, or whether it be larger media conglomerates with other business interests in front of the administration, like CBS and ABC. So it's pretty hard to focus on just one thing, but those are a few.
No, I think the dismantling of the White House press pool is a good way to probably assess where things are headed, because they're consciously starting with more unpopular legacy media to then, I think, expand outward. And also, you're looking at the political appointees that have been brought in. These are individuals that I think have done the most damage. I think these are the names that Lauren would be quick to mention too when discussing the state of open government. And so, you look at the FBI being run by Kash Patel and Dan Bongino. It's like, come on, who obviously iterations of the FBI going back the last 15 years haven't been that great for press freedom or open government. They set standards that don't involve transparency and, have their own fair amount of crackdowns on freedom of expression. But these people are just taking it to this whole other level and enforcing, basically trying to enforce a kind of natural order that serves President Donald Trump, it would seem. So Lauren, I'll allow you to get in here and say perhaps what you think is most stark. I mean, to me, as I watch I guess I'm going to lead you a little bit, just because this has been the most alarming thing in my mind, that, there are a lot of different things when it comes to freedom of the press, and they all kind of add up to the sum of its parts. But when I look at open government, just the wholesale dismantling of freedom of information offices, to me, would have to stand out to anybody who cared about this matter.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that in just a minute, but you mentioned the FBI. So one of the things I wanted to mention, and this kind of goes along with what Seth pointed out about the attack of low-hanging fruit, to date, for the most part, intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies, large law enforcement agencies, have been spared to a certain extent the kind of like Doge whackathon, to their budget that smaller agencies like CFPB and USAID have had. And certainly so to a certain extent, their FOIA offices, for example, remain at levels that they were, in the previous administration. But certainly the attack on the Health and Human Services FOIA offices at, for example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes for Health, is extremely alarming. It's alarming in part because not only will that impact FOIA requests, it's alarming because a lot of the folks who work in those FOIA offices wear multiple hats. And some of the other hats that they wear are, they are the chief records officer. So, for example, they are the person who's also working with the National Archives to make sure that records are being appropriately preserved. They're also often wearing the hat of responding to requests from the Government Accountability Office and Congress. So when we see a FOIA office get entirely laid off or gutted, we're also making it more difficult for Congress to get the information that it needs to actually conduct oversight. But when I think about, so that's certainly a big issue. But one of the things that stands out to me in terms of like Trump's egregious attacks on open government this term, I think a lot about, you guys may remember this, in March, the USAID's executive secretary, her name is Erica Carr, so Carr is a popular last name for bad actors, I guess, instructed officials at their agency to destroy and burn a bunch of classified records on grounds that were totally illegitimate. And it was not only a clear violation of the Federal Records Act, it also would have prevented the document destruction was ultimately stopped once news of it leaked, but it would have imperiled responses to FOIA requests and litigation. But one of the things that really stands out to me about this particular issue is Marco Rubio's role in this whole thing. And I find myself talking so much more about Marco Rubio this term than I ever would have wanted to. But his triple-hatted role, particularly as the acting archivist of the United States, is a growing problem. And in the USAID case, for example, he was the acting head of an agency that was unlawfully destroying records, USAID. He was also the head of the successor agency that is responsible for preserving USAID's records, which in this case was the State Department. And he's also the acting head of the agency that is supposed to not only make sure records are being preserved, but investigate when they're being unlawfully destroyed. And he has this role as the acting archivist of the United States. And this isn't an isolated incident. We can look to Signalgate as another example. Marco Rubio, in his role as a Secretary of State, was a member of that chat, which was a principal committee's meeting, and he showed absolutely no interest in that chat or in any other instance that I could see in his record keeping and preservation requirements, not only as the head of an agency, but as the acting archivist of the United States. And this has enormous implications, not only for historical records, which is what a lot of people think about when we talk about the role of the archives, but the preservation of contemporary records. And ensuring that these records are actually preserved is the only way that journalists, the public, and Congress are going to be able to understand, and the courts are going to be able to understand what DOJ is doing and other parts of the Trump administration across the federal government. And these records being preserved is the only way that future policymakers would be able to potentially rebuild and reconstruct some of the functions that are being dismantled at this very moment. So certainly the holistic attack on FOIA offices is a big one. I also think we need to keep putting pressure on Marco Rubio and his disregard for his responsibilities as the acting archivist of the United States.
All right. So we've thrown out a lot that has happened. And I think the question needs to be asked, are those who should be rising to this moment actually doing anything to fight back, and what, and do we see these I don't want to be too judgmental of like whether it's effective or not, but obviously if we see these as detrimental and important to preserving these principles, we want whatever people are doing to be effective. So like as you look around, Seth, are you seeing positive signs that there are going to be that there is good enough resistance to these attacks on freedom of the press?
Yes and no. Some folks are being vocal about it. Others are caving, as we've all seen. When you've got major news outlets, CBS, ABC, in different ways capitulating or publicly contemplating capitulation, primarily because their parent companies have other business in front of the administration, as I mentioned, that does not send an encouraging message to the far less well off, less resourced, publications and news outlets all over the country that just simply don't have access to, Mickey Mouse's money like ABC does. So the tone being set from up top is not great. Not to mention Washington Post, LA Times, all of these other sort of prestigious outlets that have, in one way or another, caved to the administration. The civil society, of course, is doing what it can. I think to an extent, folks are still figuring out the new landscape. So time is being wasted, in my view, on old tricks that were designed for a different time and place that no longer work. But that's to be expected. We're 100 days in. People can't reinvent the playbook overnight. So I expect that newer forms of resistance that are more in touch with the needs of the times will emerge. At least I hope so. But of course, that's anticipated, and that's a reason why we're seeing attacks on things like nonprofits, like civil society, law firms that afford journalists the pro bono support they need to fight back through the courts. These are all parts of this broader attack on the rule of law. The law firms, of course, they when they get the message that it's not good for business to represent folks that Trump doesn't like, of course, that's going to lead to their being hesitant to take on press freedom cases, because it's no secret Trump doesn't like press freedom. I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth. I think he would, wear a hat that says I don't like press freedom. When you attack nonprofits, you're not only attacking organizations that provide resources, advocacy, legal support, information, even sourcing that the press relies on. You're also potentially attacking a big segment of the press itself, nonprofit media, which, based on the ideas that are being floated around by the administration, could easily be deemed to support terrorism by publishing op-eds like the one that the tough student Miss Ozturk was thrown in jail for writing. If that's sufficient evidence that she supports Hamas, which is ridiculous, what about the paper that publishes that op-ed? It doesn't take a giant leap, or you don't even need to go there. You could just deem a publication to be not in the public interest. It doesn't even need to, terrorism's one way to get there, but there are number of ways that nonprofit media could be attacked. So I think that all has sort of a chilling effect on fighting back. That said, people are reporting on press freedom violations. People are talking about press freedom violations. I see editorial boards sort of stepping up to some extent. There needs to be more of that. The number one weapon that the media has to fight back is its platform. It's the media. In the past, like, you don't go to war with the person who owns the printing press. That equation has changed to some extent since Trump and Musk also have, their own printing press of sorts. But there still is significant reach and influence the media has. If not, then Trump wouldn't be so fixated on attacking them. So journalists need to just get over whatever hesitance they have about reporting on press freedom. They might think it's navel gazing. They might think it's nobody cares. They're making themselves the story. That thinking is obsolete. You're not making yourself the story. Donald Trump is making you the story. And if you don't report that story because it feels a little bit awkward for you to talk about yourself and your industry, you're really doing a disservice to your readers by not giving them the important news they need.
Yeah. And what you're saying there is crucial, because a part of the first 100 days has been observing what is going on with student journalists on these campuses and universities. and the extent to which they now feel they have to use anonymity, that people can't publish under their bylines because they may not be able to get jobs after college, or that they, basically have to take down stories and articles that have been written previously because it could result in unfair attacks on people who were participants. And it's changing the way that those training to become the next wave, the next generation of journalists approach what they do. And so I just can't imagine going through any kind of professional training right now on those campuses or universities, and dealing with these pressures, in addition to the economic pressures that have already made the media landscape a very frail and tenuous one to try and steer through. So, Lauren, when you look at people who are filing these lawsuits and are fighting for open government, how do you assess the response to the Trump administration's efforts to just thwart any kind of forced transparency?
Yeah, when I think about the ways that which, different groups and individuals can respond to excessive government secrecy, especially at a time like this, I really think it's worth mentioning that we had 4 years between Trump administrations where we didn't know all of what the Trump tactics would be this term, but we certainly knew some. And during that 4 year period, during the Biden administration, one of the major counterweights to the executive branch, which is the legislature, did not act on any of the threats that had really been highlighted during Trump's first term. For example, there were no efforts to boost resources or perhaps fund FOIA offices. There was no effort to close the loopholes in the Presidential Records Act. The National Archives didn't get more money. And while there were a few bills that were introduced in the Senate to tackle things like overclassification, none of them made it. So I think, at least when we're talking about government secrecy, we have to talk about the legislative branch and what it could have done and which it has not done. And I think it's safe to say if it didn't do it during a time, even before it was apparent that Trump was going to be the Republican nominee for this most recent election, I think we need to be realistic about what the legislature is going to do this term, which is probably not much. I could be wrong, would love to be. But I think one of the areas where we're seeing, people fight back the most is certainly the courts. I think right now, even in the best of times, for the past decade or so, if you wanted a response to your FOIA request, especially one that was sensitive, you had to go to court. And that's certainly true now, even when the records at issue aren't necessarily all that controversial. You really have to file a FOIA lawsuit if you want your records request responded to at all. And I think so far, the courts are doing a pretty good job. I think predominantly, most of them are filed in the DC circuit. Judge Boasberg has issued some really good rulings, for example, on Doge likely being subject to FOIA, but that's not the only good ruling that's come out recently. But one of the constraints of the courts is its backlog. The DC circuit in particular has a really large backlog of Freedom of Information Act litigation. And I referenced this a little bit earlier, but this is going to be a really big problem when you have a slow-moving legal process that is going up against a component, particularly like Doge, that is working far quicker than the judiciary does. So that's an imbalance. But, I think, litigation is going to continue to be extremely important. Another area where I see people responding to that's been really heartening was the community effort among archivists and just the public to preserve information that was coming down from agency websites, primarily with the end of term archiving project, which was done in coordination with the Internet Archive and a couple other groups. Things like this are extremely important, but it is, I would argue, more important that this information stay on government websites, but that's obviously not happening. And once the information comes down, it's much more difficult for it to ever find its home again back on a federal website. So these community efforts and grassroots movements to preserve things like health data, climate information is, I think, going to be increasingly important.
And since you got into what Biden was doing during his administration that didn't set us up very well for defending against Trump. It seems like before we close here, we have to mention, and I'll ask Seth to get into this, the fact that there was a federal Reporters Shield law that was on the table that could have passed, known as the Press Act. And everyone's really feeling it over the past week that we don't have it, because I think we knew that this was going to be the way that the Trump administration approached these investigations, but it's been more formalized now by Pam Bondi that they are going to be subpoenaing reporters, and that comes with threats of jail time potentially.
Yes. Pam Bondi on Friday announced the repeal of Attorney General Garland's policy that governed during the Biden administration, restricting subpoenas of journalists to force them to burn their sources, to force them to hand over their notes. Not unexpected at all, as you say, Kevin. It was in Project 2025, and Trump has made no secret that he wants to force journalists to burn their sources. He's threatened journalists who don't burn their sources with being, imprisoned and raped by their cellmates. He hasn't exactly minced words about it. So very easy to anticipate this happening, not only under Trump, but as Lauren said, under any prior to Trump, who was the front runner, DeSantis, no friend of the press. So it's not as if we can blame this on Trump taking everyone by surprise. But yes, there was the Press Act, which would have prohibited subpoenas and surveillance of journalists and their tech providers by the federal government, absent pretty serious emergency situations. That bill passed the House unanimously for the second time. So unanimous means bipartisan, of course, in January of last year. The first time it passed was in, I think, November of 2023. So that was a big rush to try to get something done by year end. Kind of understandable that couldn't move within 2 months. But January this time had a full year to get something done. And, we were in touch with the relevant Senate offices throughout the year. The original bill sponsors, Ron Wyden in the Senate, Jamie Raskin in the House, they were very motivated to get it passed and doing everything they could. But, Senator Wyden wasn't on the Judiciary Committee, and that's where the bill had to move through. Senator Durbin was on the Judiciary Committee. And we were really happy in 2023 after myself and our board member, John Cusack, wrote op-eds in the Chicago Sun-Times appealing to Durbin to support the Press Act. And he wrote back in a letter to the editor saying he would. The next time it was introduced, he sponsored the bill. Then he didn't do anything. He got the headlines, but didn't, came up with a lot of excuses why now's not the time. He and others in the committee, as well as then leader Schumer. And it's sort of an odd experience because, look, these are people who are at the highest level of the legislature. To some extent, you've got to defer to their judgment on politics and when the opportune times are to move a bill and what legislative vehicles to operate through. That's their expertise, and they've got a track record that allowed them to get to where they are. So it's hard to push back on any individual decision that they're making because they've always got what sounds like a decent reason for wanting to for their strategy. But cumulatively, after it happens a few times, you start realizing like these people, although their reasoning might make sense, they're finding reasons to get to know time and time again. They're looking for a reason to get to know and to sit on their hands and not do anything because it's easier that way. They don't want to fight a battle. They don't want to have to take their case to the public. They don't want to have to go to bat for press freedom. They're hoping to work something out behind the scenes where they can tack the legislation on quietly to some package, and that either works or it doesn't. But that's sort of the extent of the tools that they are willing to use. They're not willing to, for example, at the end of the year, after they sat on their hands long enough for Trump to be elected and for Trump to tweet out to Republicans to kill this bill, at a time when it actually had a pretty decent prospect, despite all the stalling of passing. Things were looking good. We were optimistic before Trump tweeted to kill the bill. We thought the election would finally wake people up, and that maybe Trump would be focused on other things. But no, he tweeted to kill the bill. By that point, it was a Hail Mary. But, throw the Hail Mary. Make Congress come back from their winter break to vote on some safeguards to the existential threat to American democracy that they knew full well was coming in a couple of weeks. That's not too much to ask. They already bungled the whole election, and let this guy get back in. At least, try to do something to close a couple of the doors he plans to barge through, rather than prolonging your Christmas break. But we saw a lot of, again, as I said, finding ways to get to know, and a lot of defeatist attitudes. And Durbin is my senator here in Illinois, and yeah, and all I can say is good riddance. Don't let the door hit you, because that guy, and now he wants to repeal Section 230 just to screw journalists a little bit more. So he can't leave soon enough.
And this Take It Down Act is that that's not going to, that can easily be abused against press freedom as well. So just a quick follow up, and then I'll make sure that Lauren, you get to say something before we wrap up. So, if you wanted to fold anything additional, but I was interested too, Seth, was there ever any reason why the Biden White House wouldn't openly support the Press Act? I mean, I had tracked their comments there a couple times that they were asked during White House press briefings. And, for example, like Karine Jean-Pierre would just say something like journalism isn't a crime and not really engage with the question, and then proceed to move on to the next topic, like it was self-evident that Biden supports press freedom. So why would you even think that we would oppose this? But they certainly did nothing to help the Press Act move to the finish line.
Right. Exactly. I can't guess why, but a policy makes it easy for them to say they did something, to take public credit, while not having to live with the consequences, because policies are non-binding. They can be changed, they can be repealed, they can be blamed on rogue prosecutors who didn't follow them, since there's actually no recourse for violations of those policies. So I think the preferred way to sort of have their cake and eat it too is to pass a policy and not a law they would actually have to follow. If, for example, there were a leaker who they really wanted to learn about for whatever reason, they could just, ignore the policy, or use whatever wiggle room is built into the policy to claim compliance with it. And it doesn't really go before a judge, because, again, it's not a legally binding document. So, I don't think that they wanted really to commit as a matter of law to not forcing journalists to out their sources. I'm sure they also got resistance from the intelligence agencies and from law enforcement and from others who typically oppose such things. So that's part of it. Maybe politically, they just didn't feel like fighting that fight. They didn't want to stand up to the intelligence and law enforcement agencies. That likely was part of the calculus there. But, again, they knew Trump was likely coming, as much as Biden might not have wanted to admit it. Trump was ahead in the polls. Biden was never particularly popular. It's not like there was ever a time when the election was a slam dunk for him and this whole thing caught him off guard. There was at all times a reasonable prospect of an absolute enemy of press freedom and the rule of law regaining control of the White House. Whatever concerns they might have had about a particular piece of legislation, they should have made it their priority to get those concerns resolved and get something done, rather than stalling and evading. the job of safeguarding the America we know.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Lauren, just to finish with you here, and thank you both for being part of this conversation. Uh, when we look at what's going on in the government with secrecy, I've noted that you can see some of it trickling down to various states or local jurisdictions that seem to be empowered to model what the Trump administration is doing. I just wondered if maybe you wanted to speak to anything you might recall from the last 100 days here, where obviously they're not part of the Trump administration, but it maybe there's states or cities that you can recall that seem to take their cues from the Trump administration of, like, we're going to make it harder. We're going to weaponize this process against people who are residents of these
Mm.
communities in order to further cement our political power.
Yeah, I think, regardless of who's in office, but certainly with the Trump administration, if the Trump administration does something, it gives cover to other entities, regardless of where they sit in the federal or local landscape, to do the same thing. Because, if the Trump administration does it, why should you question it when we do it? And I think one of the best places to look is, local police forces in particular, providing access or not providing access to body camera footage is certainly one of them. And also just really lax record keeping is another. But I think, in addition to kind of specific tactics, one of the overall trends of the Trump administration this term is that it's clear to me that the administration itself wants to be the sole source of information coming out of the executive branch. And it also wants to be the sole source of information and control the information that's being provided to the judiciary and the legislative. So it really wants to have an all-consuming ability to manipulate the information that the public gets. And I think this attitude and the tactics that they're using to do it, which are myriad, is becoming more apparent. And I think to a certain extent, we shouldn't be surprised if we start to see, state legislatures or governors or, sheriffs or things like that on all levels of the playing field adopt this same, unitary executive theory to their own locality. It's really concerning. And I think the best way to stop it from trickling down farther is to fight it loudly and consistently when the Trump administration is doing it.
All right. Well, I agree with you that we need as much speech and people standing up to fight back. And I'm glad that there's an organization like yours, Freedom of the Press Foundation, that's out there. Like you said, I'll just repeat here as we conclude. There's going to be a report that's on 100 examples of Trump attacking freedom of the press. I hope people will go find that. I'll definitely share a link as that gets published. And then also to look at the documenting the secrecy tracker that you're now going to be doing of the examples of government flouting transparency. So thank you both for talking with me. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to that conversation with Seth Stern and Lauren Harper. I really appreciate you listening to this show. Again, go to your preferred podcasting platform. Make sure you're following so you can get this in an audio version, or uh, follow this channel on YouTube so that you know when the next Dissenter Weekly is uploaded and shared. There are exclusive shows available for people a few days before I share it with the public. So typically, people who are subscribers get a more fresh episode of the Dissenter Weekly. And that's a way of showing people gratitude for their support of this work. Uh, Going forward, I just wanted to let everybody know that this podcast will now go to a bi-weekly publishing schedule, and I'll post a new podcast every 2 weeks. It means there will be about two, maybe 2.5 shows if I do something short. but not a full episode. And there will be 2.5 ish episodes every month from the Dissenter Weekly. It's just good information if you're a subscriber. And then, as far as the Dissenter goes in the newsletter, there will be regular articles, and I'll continue to make an attempt to put forward subscriber articles for those who are contributing, because I really do think, as much as I don't like putting journalism behind a paywall, there has to be something that is given in return to people who are showing their generosity and are willing to give to independent media publications. So I'll try not to put anything that's big breaking news behind any kind of a membership paywall. But what I will do is, if I can dig deeper and there's something more that should be fleshed out, or some kind of a story that needs to be explored further, I like to share those with people who are loyal and also give regularly to the dissenter. And it's just what we need to do in order to survive in this landscape. And it goes back to some of the things that we were talking about in the show today. So thank you for being supporters. Thank you for being listeners. And thank you for also sharing the show with other colleagues, friends, or even your own family. We have to boost this media, we have to spread this, and we have to not only champion shows like the one that I produce, but various other independent media programs. Those other independent media programs need to be promoted as well, so that we can challenge what is going on. Everybody, take care of yourself. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition of the Dissenter Weekly.